college football is going to look drastically different in 2024 because of the 12-team expanded college football playoff, which I know that there are people who believe that that diminishes the regular season. That in the past, 4-team playoff, you had to be perfect or damn near perfect to have a chance to win the championship. And now that that field is expanded, it's going to make regular season games less important. I disagree. I think it makes more regular season games more important, because if you lose in week 1 in a great non-conference game, you're relying on a lot of things to fall your way to even have a chance to win the national championship. And I think we've seen some teams in the past 5 to 10 years that have been hitting their stride late in the season that might have had a loss or 2 on their resume that could have legitimately been national championship caliber teams, but never got that chance because there's only 4 teams available. So in the 12-team playoff, there are big-time games that might, 1, determine who's going to make the college football playoff, but then 2, determine some seeding in the college football playoff that I think will be really, really, really important in the grand scheme of things. So today I've got 5 games that I think are the 5 biggest Power 4 conference games in the 2024 college football season that will play into what goes down and how we will remember the 2024 college football season. So the first one, and there's not a lot of people talking about this, and I think part of it is because of just history, where Miami has been one of those programs where the hype has been a bit much at times in the past couple of years, where Miami is back, or this is the year Miami bounces back. If Miami doesn't bounce back in 2024, Miami will never bounce back in at all. If Miami is not a college football playoff contender in 2024, I don't know when they're going to do it, because the schedule is so unbelievably bad for Miami that if they do not win 10 games, I think it will be viewed as an abject failure for the Hurricanes. So my number 5 slot in the most important games is Miami at Florida State. Now, not only is it the most challenging game on Miami's schedule by what I think is a pretty wide margin, it's one of 3 opportunities that Florida State could find themselves tripped up. And after kind of having an irrational response to not making a college football playoff in 2023, I think people are penciling them in to win the ACC in 2024. And I don't think that's an outrageous take at all. But I do think if you're going to have the reaction you had, you better have a really good 2024. Now, Florida State has games home against Clemson, at Miami, at Notre Dame. Those are kind of the 3 that I would highlight. It was like, we got to pay attention. Miami is home for Florida State, and at Louisville are the 2 games, and they're back-to-back in October, that I would say, like, hey, you can have a slip-up in one of those, but anything else is a huge problem. Miami's schedule is at Florida, Florida A&M, Ball State, at USF, Virginia, at Cal, bye week, at Louisville, Florida State, Duke, at Georgia Tech, Wake Forest, at Syracuse. They don't play North Carolina. They don't play Clemson. Miami's schedule is as bad as a Power 4 conference team can be in 2024. Getting off the bus, Miami should win 9 games. Best case scenario, they should go 12-0. I guess they should. Best case scenario is 12-0. If Miami's anything less than 10-2, it has been a really big problem. So, if Miami can beat Florida State, I think that means Miami's having a pretty good year and could legitimately be a challenger for the college football playoff. If they can't, they don't have a shot. On the flip side, if Florida State loses to Miami, they better hope they don't have another loss, because I don't know that the ACC is going to get 2 teams into the college football playoff, the champion of that conference, unless it's Miami at 11-1 or 11-2, and both of their losses are to Florida State, and Florida State's 13-0. I don't know that you're going to get 2 teams from that conference in. So Miami at Florida State is, to me, a really, really, really big game. The number 4 on my list, I have Texas at Michigan. I think it's a natural thought process to think that Michigan is going to take a step backwards in 2024. After winning the national championship in 2023, new head coach, you lose damn near half the roster that were seniors and super seniors and graduate players and all of those things. You lose a bunch of guys. Now, that's not to say that they are untalented or anything like that. They are still talented, but you have a first-time head coach, and the season, you don't get a whole lot of run-up to playing what is absolutely going to be viewed as a top 5 team at that point in the season in Texas. Now, I think it's a litmus test for Michigan. I don't even think they have to win the game. They just can't get their asses kicked at home to disqualify them down the line as we look at the college football playoff resumes, and you're starting to look at spots, like 9, 10, 11, and Michigan can say, like, hey, we lost to Texas 17-14 in the rain or whatever, rather than, yeah, we got beat by Texas 56-3, but we went 10-1 after that or whatever. Or they went 9-1 after that or whatever the case may be. For Texas, I think to go on the road to the defending national champions and grab a win, despite it being a first-year head coach, despite losing a big chunk of their roster, whatever the case may be, that's going to be impressive and can be viewed as a really marquee win, depending on what Michigan does the rest of the season. But if Michigan can get a win over a Texas squad that is going to have a really difficult schedule, but has high aspirations in 2024, that's going to go a long way in helping them down the line. So I think it's more of a measuring stick game for Michigan more than anything, but it's an important measuring stick. If they don't lose a whole lot, if they don't look out of place in that game, I think that's a really good spot for them to be in. And for Texas, if they can play at a really high level early in the season, I think that means a lot. So Texas, Michigan, to me, is a very big game. I think Ohio State at Oregon has the potential to be a number 1 versus number 2 matchup when they play in October. Now, some other things have to shake out, and maybe somebody has to play a little worse or than people are expecting or whatever the case may be. But I think that's absolutely 2 top 5 to top 8 teams going at it in what is going to be a marquee Big Ten game. There is a knock on Ryan Day that Ryan Day doesn't win big games. There's a knock on Dan Lanning that last year the 2 games they lost were his fault. Somebody's going to buck that perception in that game, whether it's a close pulled out victory due to somebody being a tactician or it's just a pure ass kicking from one side or the other. Somebody's going to buck that trend, and it's going to go a long way in deciding some seeds, deciding who plays in the Big Ten championship game. Potentially, if this ends up being a rematch in the Big Ten championship game, there's a lot to figure out throughout an 18-team Big Ten, but this is as big of a regular season game as you'll get in that conference. And you get a team from the East Coast playing on the West Coast. There's just a whole lot of factors there. And so I think that has the possibility of being a really, really, really hyped game, a game that's going to be viewed as the game of the week. That might be one of those games that ends up being the college game day spot that week, even though Ohio State at Oregon isn't an ESPN game. It's going to be a game of that magnitude. I think it's at least probably going to be a top 5 matchup, 2 versus 5, 1 versus 5, something like that. Don't be surprised if it's that. And so when you get those numbers next to team names, it's undoubtedly going to be one of the top 5 games of the regular season, or at least leading up to it, it will be. Number 2, I think, is super interesting in deciding who does and doesn't make the college football playoff. Because as good as I think the SEC is going to be in 2024, there's going to be a natural limit on just how many teams from that conference, or one conference in particular, whether it's the Big Ten, whether it's the SEC, whether it's the ACC, Big 12, whatever the case may be. I don't think we're ever going to get to a spot where, like, okay, there are 6 teams from the SEC in the college football playoff, or there are, like, I just don't think it's going to be that level. So my number 2 is Ole Miss at LSU. I'm pretty high on Ole Miss. I've said before, I think Ole Miss is one of those programs that benefits a ton from the number of teams making the playoff going from 4 to 12. Because even if it was a 6 or 8 team playoff, that's a hard number for Ole Miss to accomplish. But 12 is pretty expansive for Ole Miss. You've got 5 guaranteed slots and 7 slots for at-larges. The chances of Ole Miss being one of the 7 at-larges is a hell of a lot better than if they were 5 conference champions and 3 at-large spots. But there's going to be a log jam of teams that are 10-2 and 9-3, and the 9-3 teams having impressive wins and losses against teams that are in the top 1 through 15, right? I think Ole Miss is a 7 through 10 seed in the college football playoff sitting here in June. And I think LSU has that same ability. They're going to take a somewhat of a step back because they don't have the Heisman Trophy winner playing quarterback for them. But if they can weather the storm for a little bit, if they can play really good defense, they can get scores from special teams and defense, play low-scoring games, and play everyone tight, LSU's schedule is it's one of those that's like it's both somewhat difficult in stretches, and then you got some easy stretches too. Like their non-conference is USC, Nicholls State, UCLA, and South Alabama. Now, when you're putting that schedule together, USC versus LSU in Las Vegas on the Sunday before Labor Day sounds like, oh, that's a big time game. I don't think it is. The conference schedule, they play Ole Miss at Texas A&M, Alabama, Oklahoma. If they can go 2-2 in those 4 games, I like their chances because I think that probably means they're 9-3 or 10-2. If they can go 3-1 against Ole Miss, A&M, Alabama, Oklahoma, there's a really good chance that they're in. And on the flip side, I don't know that Ole Miss, who's and no SEC non-conference schedule is going to be all that difficult, but Furman, Middle Tennessee State, Wake Forest, Georgia Southern is not murderer's row. They play at LSU, Oklahoma, and Georgia. I think Ole Miss is much more likely to be 10-2 than LSU is, but if they fall to LSU, it's a real tough spot. So I think that is a game that, like, this is one of those quintessential, this is going to decide who makes the college football playoff and who doesn't. Because if it's a 10-2 Ole Miss versus a 9-3 LSU, but LSU beat Ole Miss, you have to put the Tigers in. And I don't want to get into that kind of like minutia already, but I think it's going to be a really pivotal game in deciding who gets into those 12 spots and who is left out wondering just what the hell we had to do to get into the field. And then the number 1 game, I mentioned Ohio State, Oregon is a game that could be a top 1 versus 2. Also, that could be a 1 versus 2 is the very next week after that is Georgia at Texas. Georgia has not played a great schedule in the last couple of years. And it sort of came back to bite them last year that they lost a game at the worst possible time when there's a logjam of 1-loss teams and they don't make the college football playoff. Georgia's schedule in 2024 is pretty good. Neutral site game against Clemson, at Kentucky, at Alabama, at Texas, at Ole Miss, home for Tennessee. There are much more challenging games for the Bulldogs in 2024 than has been on the schedule in recent years. But Georgia, Texas on October 19th has every inkling that this could be 1 versus 2. And you get 2 big-time brands, Texas in their first year in the SEC with what I think is probably the Heisman Trophy frontrunner in Quinn Ewers. You're home for a big-time game, and then 1 versus 2. I think the reason I have it at number 1 is because I think it's probably a number 1 versus number 2 matchup. But then also, I think it goes a long way in deciding who is the number 1 overall seed in the college football playoff come December. And I think it's probably really easy for these 2 schools to match up again in the SEC championship game. But Georgia, Texas is going to be a very good football game. And like like Ohio State at Oregon, it's at minimum a top 5 matchup. Unless somebody has a big time loss before that. I don't think Georgia's going to lose to Alabama in September, because I think Alabama's going to struggle a little bit at the start of the season. But at minimum, it's a top 10 matchup, because if Georgia loses to Alabama, it's going to be because Alabama is a top 5 team and Georgia's going to be the number 1 team going into the season. So they're not going to fall out of the top 10. But I think Georgia, Texas has all of the makings to be the game of the college football season. And it's going to go a long way in deciding a lot of the discussion, shaping the discussion about who should be the number 1 team going into the college football playoff. From an October game, and you get to December and we start figuring out who is the number 1 team, I think that game is going to be the deciding factor. That'll do it for today's episode of the Daily Huddle. Appreciate you making us a part of your day, however it is, wherever it is you're doing so. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button. Make sure you're getting all the great college football content that we're pumping out. If you're listening on the podcast feed, drop a 5-star review. It goes a long way in helping out the channel. See you tomorrow for another episode here of the Daily Huddle.